The quiet suburban street buzzed with an uneasy energy. It wasn't the usual calm morning where neighbors exchanged polite nods and children played on their lawns. Today, the air was heavy with tension, and at the center of it all was the Johnson family's modest rental home. Thomas Blake, the landlord, stood on their front porch. Tall and broad-shouldered, his crisp blazer and polished shoes seemed almost out of place in the unassuming neighborhood. His expression was one of cold indifference, but his sharp eyes betrayed a simmering arrogance. He didn't knock. He pounded on the door with the force of a man who believed he owned not just the property, but the people inside it. The door opened slowly, revealing Marcus Johnson, a man of quiet strength. Marcus stood tall, his posture unyielding, though his face betrayed no hint of anger. Behind him, his wife Elena peered over his shoulder, her protective instincts heightened as she clutched their daughter, Kayla's hand. Kayla, just 9 years old, held a stuffed bunny close to her chest, her wide, innocent eyes darting nervously between her parents and the man on their porch. Blake didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mr. Johnson," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "I believe we've had this conversation before. This neighborhood isn't meant for people like you." Marcus's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "People like us," he repeated, his tone measured but firm. "We've paid our rent on time every month. Our record is spotless. What exactly is the problem?" Blake scoffed, crossing his arms as if the answer were obvious. "The problem, Mr. Johnson, is that this neighborhood has a certain character to uphold. And frankly, you and your family don't fit." Elena stepped forward, her voice trembling with restrained anger. "What you're doing is illegal. You can't evict us without cause." Blake smirked, leaning casually against the doorframe. "A week," he said, ignoring her protest. "You have 1 week to pack up and leave. Consider it a generous timeline." Elena's eyes widened in disbelief. "A week? Are you out of your mind? We have rights." Blake shrugged, as if the details didn't concern him. "Take it up with the courts if you like. But let me save you the trouble. My lawyer has ensured that everything is in order. You won't win." Kayla tugged on her mother's hand, her small voice trembling. "Mommy, are we in trouble?" Elena knelt to her daughter's level, brushing a tear from her cheek. "No, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We're not in trouble. We're just dealing with a very rude man." Marcus remained unmoving, his gaze fixed on Blake. "You might think you've won," he said evenly, "but this isn't over." Blake chuckled, stepping back off the porch. "Oh, it's over, Mr. Johnson. People like you always lose. It's just a matter of time." He turned and strolled back to his luxury car, his smug grin lingering in the air like a bad stench. Inside the house, the atmosphere was tense. Marcus sat at the dining table, surrounded by eviction notices and legal documents. The papers blurred together as he stared at them, his mind racing. Elena paced the room, her frustration bubbling over. "This can't be happening," she said, throwing her hands up. "We've done everything right. How does someone like him get away with this?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Because people like him think they're untouchable. They think the law works for them and no one else." Elena stopped pacing, turning to face him. "And what are we supposed to do, Marcus? Just pack up and leave. Let him win." Marcus looked at her, his resolve hardening. "No," he said quietly. "We're not leaving. Not like this." Kayla wandered into the room, clutching her stuffed bunny. She climbed onto Marcus's lap, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "Daddy, I don't want to leave our house," she said softly. Marcus hugged her tightly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We're not leaving, baby girl. Not if I can help it." That night, the Johnson family began to pack, not out of defeat but necessity. The reality of the looming eviction was undeniable, but Marcus's mind was already formulating a plan. As Elena filled boxes with their belongings, she caught Marcus scribbling notes and scanning through legal codes on his laptop. "What are you doing?" she asked, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Preparing," he replied simply. "Blake thinks he can push us around because we're just tenants to him. But he doesn't know who he's dealing with." Elena's expression softened. "You're going to fight him, aren't you?" Marcus looked up, his determination unwavering. "I'm not just fighting for us, Elena. I'm fighting for everyone he's ever done this to." Across town, Blake sat in his lavish living room, sipping a glass of wine. His wife, Deborah, glanced at him from across the room, her disinterest evident as she leafed through a magazine. "You seem pleased with yourself," she said, her voice dripping with boredom. Blake smirked, swirling the wine in his glass. "Why shouldn't I be? I've handled the problem." Deborah raised an eyebrow. "Handled? You mean you bullied them out of their home?" Blake shrugged. "It's business. Besides, they're not exactly the type of tenants we need around here." Deborah shook her head, but said nothing more. To her, this was just another one of her husband's power plays. She didn't care enough to challenge him, and he didn't care enough to explain himself further. As the night deepened, Marcus sat alone at the dining table, a stack of papers in front of him. He glanced at a photo of his family sitting on the mantel, their smiles a stark contrast to the weight of the present moment. He picked up his phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. "David, it's Marcus. I need your help." On the other end of the line, David Ramirez, an old friend and investigative journalist, leaned back in his chair. "Marcus Johnson," he said, a hint of surprise in his voice. "It's been a while. What's going on?" Marcus's voice was firm, each word carrying the weight of his resolve. "I need to take down a man who thinks he's untouchable, and I need your expertise to do it." David's curiosity was piqued. "Tell me everything." As Marcus began to outline the situation, the first sparks of a plan began to take shape. Blake had underestimated him, and that would prove to be his biggest mistake. The first rays of morning sunlight streamed through the blinds as Marcus sat at the dining table, papers spread out in front of him like a battlefield map. His laptop screen glowed, filled with housing regulations, tenant rights, and legal precedents. His face was a picture of focused determination, but the dark circles under his eyes betrayed a sleepless night. Elena shuffled into the kitchen, still in her robe, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She placed one in front of him and studied his expression. "You didn't sleep, did you?" she asked softly. Marcus shook his head, barely glancing up. "I couldn't. There's too much to do." Elena sighed, sitting across from him. "You're taking this on alone. Let me help." Marcus looked up, his expression softening. "You already are, Elena. Just knowing you're with me in this is all the help I need." Elena wasn't entirely convinced, but let the moment pass. Her eyes drifted to the legal jargon on the screen. "So, what's the plan?" Marcus leaned back, stretching his shoulders. "Blake thinks this is over, that we'll just pack up and leave quietly. But he doesn't know I have the law on my side, and a little help from an old friend." "David?" Elena asked, her brows lifting. Marcus nodded. "He's already looking into Blake's history. If there's anything shady about his business practices, David will find it." At that moment, Kayla wandered into the room, rubbing her eyes and dragging her stuffed bunny behind her. "Daddy, are we going to a new house?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Marcus pulled her into his lap, his heart aching at her innocence. "We're staying right here for now, sweetheart. Daddy's working on something to make sure we don't have to go anywhere." Kayla tilted her head, her sleepy eyes full of trust. "Can I help?" Marcus chuckled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You're helping just by being you." Later that morning, Marcus placed a call to David Ramirez, who answered almost immediately. "Morning, Marcus," David said, his tone already businesslike. "I've been digging into Blake's background, and let me tell you, this guy's got skeletons in his closet." Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. How bad are we talking? David's voice carried a hint of satisfaction. Let's just say he's not exactly the squeaky clean businessman he pretends to be. I've found evidence of illegal evictions, falsified documents, and even some questionable tax filings. If we play this right, we can bury him. Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. That's exactly what I needed to hear. Can you send me everything you've got? Already on it, David replied. Check your inbox in an hour. As the call ended, Marcus felt a surge of confidence. The pieces were falling into place, but he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Blake wasn't the type to go down without a fight. Across town, Blake sat in his plush office, reviewing property portfolios with a self-satisfied smirk. The eviction was already out of his mind, a mere blip on his radar. But his assistant entered the room hesitantly, holding a tablet. Mr. Blake, you might want to see this, she said, her voice shaky. Blake snatched the tablet and frowned as he scanned the screen. It was an email alert about an upcoming exposé from a well-known journalist, David Ramirez. The subject line read, Landlord's Dark Secrets Unveiled. Blake's face darkened. What the hell is this? He growled. His assistant shifted nervously. It looks like someone's investigating your properties. It's already making waves online. Blake slammed the tablet onto his desk, his jaw clenched. I'll handle it, he snapped. But for the first time, a flicker of unease passed through him. He knew his past wasn't spotless, but he had always managed to keep it buried. Now, it seemed someone was determined to dig all up. Back at the Johnson home, Marcus received the email from David. The file was extensive, detailing Blake's history of dubious practices. As Marcus read through it, a plan began to solidify in his mind. He printed the documents, carefully organizing them into a folder. Elena watched him from across the room, her worry mingling with admiration. You're really going to take him to court? Marcus looked up, his eyes blazing with determination. Not just court. I'm going to expose him for the fraud he is. By the time this is over, everyone will know who Thomas Blake really is. That evening, as the Johnsons sat down for dinner, the tension in the air had begun to shift. Kayla's laughter echoed through the house, a sound that reminded Marcus of what he was fighting for. As he tucked her into bed later, she asked, Will the bad man go away? Marcus knelt beside her, stroking her hair. Sometimes bad people don't go away on their own, but when we stand up to them, we can make sure they can't hurt anyone else. Kayla smiled, her eyes closing as she drifted to sleep. Marcus stood, a sense of purpose washing over him. Blake had underestimated him, but that would prove to be his undoing. In the quiet of the night, Marcus sat back down at the dining table, the folder of evidence in front of him. He picked up his phone and made another call. Hello, I'd like to schedule a meeting to file a formal lawsuit, he said. His voice was steady, his resolve unshakable. Thomas Blake had made a mistake. He thought he was evicting a tenant. What he didn't realize was that he had awakened a fighter. The courthouse loomed ahead, a stately building of stone and glass that seemed to radiate authority. Marcus stood at the base of the steps, clutching a leather-bound folder packed with evidence. He adjusted his tie, his nerves momentarily getting the best of him. But as he looked up at the courthouse, the weight of his purpose steadied him. This wasn't just about his family anymore. It was about justice. As he walked through the heavy doors, the clatter of shoes on polished floors echoed around him. David Ramirez was already waiting in the lobby, leaning casually against a pillar. The journalist's sharp eyes lit up as he spotted Marcus. You look like a man ready to take down a giant, David said, extending a hand. Marcus shook it firmly. I've got the sling, he replied, tapping the folder. Now, we just need to find the right angle. David grinned. Oh? We've got more than an angle. Blake's entire foundation is built on quicksand. The moment you step into that courtroom, it's going to start sinking. The two men discussed strategy as they made their way to the clerk's office. Marcus filed a lawsuit, a wave of both relief and anticipation washing over him. By the time they left the courthouse, the wheels were officially in motion. That evening, Marcus and Elena sat in their living room, reviewing the day's events. Kayla played quietly on the floor, oblivious to the gravity of what her parents were facing. Elena set down her cup of tea, her brows furrowed with concern. "Do you think he'll retaliate?" she asked. "Blake doesn't seem like the type to go down without a fight." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He'll try," he admitted, "but we've got him cornered. The evidence is too strong." Elena leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And if he plays dirty? Marcus, we've seen what he's capable of." Marcus reached for her hand, his grip firm but reassuring. "Then we'll be ready. I won't let him intimidate us." Across town, Blake's office was anything but calm. His assistant stood nervously by the door as Blake paced the room, his phone pressed to his ear. His lawyer, Richard Vaughn, was on the line, his tone clipped and professional. "Marcus Johnson has filed a lawsuit," Richard said. "And it's not just about the eviction. He's accusing you of discriminatory practices and fraudulent business dealings. This could get very messy." Blake scoffed, though his hand trembled slightly as he poured himself a drink. "Messy. It's a tenant with a grudge. How hard can it be to shut him down?" Richard hesitated. "This tenant is a lawyer, Thomas. And from what I've seen, he knows exactly what he's doing." Blake slammed his glass onto the desk. "Then you fix it. Countersue, discredit him. I don't care how. Just make this go away." The following morning, Marcus found a thick envelope on his doorstep. Inside was a letter from Blake's legal team, filled with counterclaims accusing Marcus of defamation and harassment. The letter demanded an immediate withdrawal of the lawsuit, accompanied by a thinly veiled threat of further legal action. Elena read the letter aloud, her voice growing more incredulous with each sentence. "Defamation? Trespassing? This is absurd." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his lips curving into a faint smile. "It's a scare tactic," he said. "Blake's trying to rattle us." Elena crossed her arms, her frustration evident. "Well, it's working. How are we supposed to fight someone with this much money and powers?" Marcus's eyes darkened with resolve. "By staying focused. He's bluffing, and he knows it. That's why he's trying so hard to intimidate us." Later that day, Marcus met with David to strategize their next move. David slid a folder across the table, his expression triumphant. "I've got something that might speed things up," he said. "Financial records showing Blake's been skimming from his own properties. Tax fraud, Marcus. If we leak this, his investors will drop him like a hot potato." Marcus opened the folder, scanning the documents. "This is big," he said, his mind already racing. "If we play this right, we won't just win the case. We'll destroy his credibility." David leaned back in his chair, his grin widening. "Exactly. And once the press gets a hold of this, Blake won't just be fighting you. He'll be fighting to keep his entire business afloat." That night, as Marcus prepared for the days ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was about to get much more intense. Blake had power, influence, and resources, but Marcus had something stronger: the truth. And he was ready to use it. The morning brought an ominous calm. Marcus sat in the kitchen, staring at a fresh stack of documents on the table. Elena moved about quietly, preparing breakfast, her worry etched into every movement. Even Kayla, usually bursting with energy, sensed the tension in the air. The envelope from Blake's legal team lay open in front of Marcus, its contents a stark reminder of the stakes. The counterclaims were aggressive and layered with legal jargon designed to intimidate. But instead of fear, Marcus felt a growing resolve. Blake was trying to play hardball, and Marcus wasn't about to back down. Elena sat beside him, placing a plate of toast and eggs in front of him. "He's coming at us with everything he's got," she said softly. "What's the next move?" Marcus tapped the pile of papers. Blake's overplaying his hand. His counterclaims are full of holes, and I have enough evidence to prove he's acting in bad faith. But it's not just about court anymore. It's about exposing him publicly. If we shine a light on everything he's done, his empire will crumble. Later that day, Marcus met with David Ramirez in a quiet corner of a bustling cafe. David leaned forward, sliding his laptop across the table. "You're going to love this," he said, a mischievous glint in his eyes. On the screen were emails and financial records that painted a damning picture of Blake's business dealings. "This isn't just fraud," David continued. "It's a pattern of exploitation. He's been inflating maintenance costs, double-charging tenants, and hiding income from the IRS. If we go public with this, his investors will scatter." Marcus studied the screen, his mind racing. "This is the kind of leverage we need. The court case is important, but if we take this to the press, Blake won't just lose the case. He'll lose everything." Meanwhile, Blake sat in his office, trying to control the growing chaos. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from nervous investors, reporters, and even tenants demanding answers. His lawyer, Richard Vaughn, sat across from him, his expression grim. "Marcus Johnson isn't backing down," Richard said. "And now, Ramirez has joined the fight. They're leaking damaging information, and it's only a matter of time before this spirals out of control." Blake slammed his fist on the desk. "I don't care what it takes. Shut them up. Threaten bribe. Do whatever you have to do." Richard hesitated, his tone cautious. "That could backfire. If they catch us trying to intimidate witnesses or manipulate evidence, it'll destroy any defense we have left." Blake's eyes narrowed. "Then find something on Marcus. Dig into his past, his career, his family. There has to be something we can use." The next day, Marcus received an unexpected call from an old colleague. "Marcus," the voice on the other end said, "Blake's people are asking questions about you. Be careful. He's trying to discredit you." Marcus hung up, his jaw tightening. He had expected Blake to fight dirty, but the thought of his family being dragged into the fray stoked a fire in his chest. That evening, he sat down with Elena, explaining what they might face in the coming days. "If Blake can't win in court, he'll try to destroy our reputation," Marcus said. "But the truth is on our side. As long as we stick to the facts, he can't touch us." Elena nodded, her eyes fierce. "Then let him come. We've already lost our home. What else can he take from us?" While Blake's camp scrambled to counter the mounting pressure, Marcus and David executed their plan. David released a bombshell article detailing Blake's financial fraud and discriminatory practices, complete with testimony from former tenants. The piece spread like wildfire, dominating headlines and social media feeds. By nightfall, Blake's name was plastered across every major news outlet. Investors began pulling out, tenants filed complaints en masse, and local officials launched an investigation into his properties. The carefully constructed facade of his empire was beginning to crack. As Marcus watched the news coverage from his living room, he felt a surge of hope. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, the scales were tipping in his favor. Blake had underestimated him, and now the consequences were catching up. Across town, Blake sat in his mansion, staring blankly at the TV. The headlines scrolled across the screen like a taunt. Landlord's corruption exposed. Fraud and discrimination at the core of Blake Properties. For the first time, fear crept into his eyes. He had always believed he was untouchable, but now the walls were closing in. Back at home, Marcus closed his laptop, a faint smile playing on his lips. The fight was far from over, but Blake had finally felt the first blow, and Marcus was ready to deliver the next one. The courtroom buzzed with quiet intensity as Marcus entered, his leather briefcase in hand. The gallery was packed. Reporters, former tenants, and curious onlookers filled every seat, all eager to witness the highly publicized trial of Thomas Blake. At the front of the room, Blake sat rigidly at his table, flanked by his lawyer Richard Vaughn. The once confident landlord now looked weathered, the weight of his crumbling empire evident in his sunken eyes. Judge Naomi Carter, a composed woman with decades of experience, entered the room and called for order. Her gavel's sharp crack silenced the murmurs as she addressed the court. "We are here today to hear the case of Johnson versus Blake. Counsel, you may proceed." Marcus rose from his seat, his presence commanding but calm. He opened with a brief but powerful statement, laying the groundwork for what was to come. "Your Honor, this case isn't just about my family being wrongfully evicted. It's about a pattern of systemic abuse, discrimination, and corruption that has gone unchecked for far too long." He presented his evidence meticulously, piece by piece. Emails detailing Blake's discriminatory practices, forged maintenance invoices, and testimonies from former tenants painted a damning picture. Each exhibit landed like a hammer blow, leaving little room for doubt. As Marcus cross-examined one of Blake's loyal tenants, who claimed to have never experienced any issues, he skillfully dismantled their credibility. "Isn't it true," Marcus asked, his tone sharp, "that your rent was reduced by 50% just 2 weeks ago?" The tenant hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. "I don't recall." Marcus raised an eyebrow, holding up a document. "Perhaps this invoice will refresh your memory. It clearly shows a sudden reduction in your rent, dated precisely 14 days before you agreed to testify." The gallery erupted in murmurs, and Judge Carter banged her gavel. "Order in the court." Blake's lawyer, Richard, attempted to regain control, painting Marcus as a disgruntled tenant with a vendetta. "Your Honor," Richard argued, "my client has managed his properties for years without issue. This case is an attempt to smear his reputation based on isolated incidents." Marcus responded with quiet confidence. "Isolated incidents." He gestured to the gallery, where former tenants nodded in silent solidarity. "How many isolated incidents does it take to reveal a pattern?" The turning point came when David Ramirez took the stand, armed with financial records that laid bare Blake's fraudulent activities. The journalist's testimony was compelling, exposing years of hidden income and falsified expenses. "This isn't just bad business," David stated. "It's criminal." Blake's face grew paler with each revelation, and Richard's defenses became increasingly frantic. The once imposing landlord now looked like a man grasping at straws. As the day wore on, Marcus delivered his closing arguments. He stood before the jury, his voice steady but impassioned. "This case is bigger than my family. It's about every family who's been bullied, silenced, or pushed out of their homes because someone thought they could act without consequence. Today, you have the power to say that no one is above the law." The courtroom fell silent as the jury was dismissed to deliberate. Marcus returned to his seat beside Elena, who squeezed his hand tightly. Kayla, sitting between them, leaned over and whispered, "Daddy, are we winning?" Marcus smiled softly. "I think we are, sweetheart." Hours later, the jury returned, their expressions somber but resolute. The foreman stood, clearing his throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Thomas Blake, guilty of illegal evictions, discriminatory practices, and fraudulent business dealings." The gallery erupted in cheers, and Marcus exhaled deeply, the weight of weeks of stress lifting from his shoulders. Elena wrapped her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. Kayla clapped her hands excitedly, not fully understanding the gravity of the moment, but feeling the joy in the room. Blake sat frozen, his face a mixture of shock and despair. His lawyer whispered urgently to him, but Blake didn't respond. For the first time, the man who had always controlled every situation found himself utterly powerless. As Marcus exited the courthouse, he was greeted by a throng of reporters. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust toward him. "Mr. Johnson, how do you feel about the verdict?" one reporter asked. Marcus paused, his arm around Elena, as Kayla held his hand. "This isn't just a victory for us," he said. It's a victory for justice. It's proof that no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, the truth will always prevail. The crowd erupted in applause as Marcus and his family walked away, their heads held high. But Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The fight had exposed a broken system, and there was still work to be done to ensure no one else endured what they had faced. The aftermath of the trial sent shockwaves through the community. News outlets splashed Thomas Blake's name across their headlines, detailing his fraudulent practices and discriminatory actions. His face, once a symbol of power and control, now represented disgrace. Investors began pulling out, leaving his properties in financial disarray. Tenants who once feared speaking out now found their voices, filing complaints and lawsuits en masse. For Marcus, the victory in court was only part of the battle. He knew that bringing down Blake's empire required more than a guilty verdict. It required dismantling the very foundation of his operations. Back at home, Marcus pored over more documents with David Ramirez. Together, they mapped out the next steps. "This guy didn't just cheat tenants," David said, pointing at a stack of tax records. "He's been skimming money off his own investors and hiding it offshore. If we leak this, it's game over." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "We need to time it perfectly. The court case has weakened him, but this will bury him." Meanwhile, Blake sat in the dark confines of his once lavish office, the blinds drawn to keep out prying eyes. Papers and files were strewn across his desk, and his usually pristine suit was rumpled. He hadn't slept in days, the mounting pressure eroding his composure. His lawyer, Richard Vaughn, entered the room, his expression grim. "Thomas, we've got a problem. The IRS has opened an investigation into your finances. They're looking at everything." Blake's fist slammed against the desk, his face red with fury. "You're supposed to handle this," he shouted. "Why am I paying you if you can't keep them off my back?" Richard hesitated before responding. "There's only so much I can do, Thomas. This isn't just Marcus Johnson anymore. The media, the former tenants, the authorities, they're all circling. You need to think about damage control." Blake sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Damage control? The only damage I need to control is that self-righteous lawyer and his little journalist friend." Later that night, Blake made a desperate move. He called in favors from powerful allies, seeking help to salvage what was left of his reputation. But the calls were met with silence or outright refusals. His connections, once reliable, were now distancing themselves from the sinking ship that was his career. As Blake's empire crumbled, Marcus and David executed their next strike. David published a scathing exposé detailing Blake's financial fraud in painstaking detail. The article included records of offshore accounts, falsified tax returns, and testimonies from former business partners who had been burned by Blake's greed. The story spread like wildfire, dominating headlines and social media. Blake's response was swift but desperate. He held a press conference, hoping to sway public opinion. Standing before a small crowd of reporters, he delivered a carefully rehearsed apology. "I've made mistakes," he began, his voice trembling just enough to seem genuine. "But I've always had the best intentions for my tenants and my community." The act might have worked if not for the breaking news alert that interrupted his speech. A reporter's phone buzzed with a notification. New evidence ties Blake to major tax fraud scheme. Whispers spread through the crowd, and within minutes, the reporters turned on him, bombarding him with questions. "How do you explain these offshore accounts, Mr. Blake? Will you cooperate with the IRS investigation? Do you plan to step down as the head of Blake Properties?" Blake's composure cracked. He stammered, his carefully crafted image unraveling before the cameras. "This is a smear campaign," he barked before storming off the stage. The footage aired on every major network, solidifying his public downfall. Back at home, Marcus watched the chaos unfold on TV. Elena sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "It's happening," she said softly. "He's finally facing the consequences." Marcus nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. "It's not just about him losing. It's about making sure no one else can do what he did." Kayla peeked around the corner, clutching her stuffed bunny. "Daddy, is the bad man gone?" Marcus smiled gently, pulling her onto his lap. "Almost, sweetheart. And when he's gone, we're going to help make sure no one like him comes back." As the night deepened, Blake sat alone in his mansion, the echoes of his once thriving empire haunting the empty halls. His phone stopped ringing, and his inbox was flooded with demands for repayment. For the first time, Thomas Blake felt the crushing weight of his own actions. And this time, there was no escape. The courthouse was silent, except for the soft rustle of papers and the occasional whisper among spectators. The final day of the trial had arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. Marcus sat at his table, a picture of calm resolve, while Elena and Kayla watched from the gallery. Across the room, Thomas Blake sat hunched, his face pale and his eyes darting nervously. His lawyer, Richard Vaughn, leaned in, whispering urgently, but Blake barely reacted. The once mighty landlord was visibly unraveling. Judge Naomi Carter entered, her gavel striking like thunder. "This court is now in session," she declared. "We will hear closing arguments before the jury deliberates." Marcus rose first, his presence commanding yet measured. He approached the jury, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "This case isn't just about my family's wrongful eviction," he began, his words slicing through the room. "It's about a man who believed he was above the law, who used his power to exploit and intimidate. But today, you have the power to say enough is enough." He presented one final piece of evidence, a damning email exchange between Blake and his property managers. In it, Blake explicitly instructed them to target minority tenants with higher fees and stricter penalties. The gallery gasped, and Blake's face drained of color. Marcus continued, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern, a deliberate strategy to strip people of their dignity and their rights. But today, you can ensure justice prevails, not just for my family, but for everyone who has ever been silenced." The jury hung on his every word, their expressions shifting from shock to determination. Marcus returned to his seat, his shoulders squared. He had done everything he could. Blake's lawyer, Richard, stood next, his tone defensive and desperate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, pacing nervously, "my client is a respected businessman who has contributed to this community for years. These accusations are nothing more than an attempt to tarnish his reputation." But the jury's faces remained stone cold. The evidence was too overwhelming, the testimonies too vivid. Richard's words fell flat, and even he seemed to sense the futility of his argument. When the closing statements ended, Judge Carter addressed the jury. "You have heard the evidence, reviewed the testimonies, and seen the documents. It is now your duty to deliberate and deliver a verdict." The jury filed out, leaving the courtroom in a tense silence. Marcus turned to Elena, who reached for his hand. "No matter what happens," she whispered, "you've already made a difference." Marcus nodded, though his heart pounded in his chest. The weight of the trial, the weeks of preparation, and the stakes of the verdict all pressed down on him. Hours passed, and the jury finally returned. The foreman stood, a folded piece of paper in his hands. Judge Carter addressed him. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreman nodded. "We have, Your Honor." The room held its collective breath as the verdict was read. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Thomas Blake, guilty of all charges." The gallery erupted in applause, and the judge's gavel struggled to restore order. Marcus closed his eyes, exhaling deeply as a wave of relief washed over him. Elena embraced him tightly, tears streaming down her face, while Kayla clapped excitedly, unaware of the full weight of the moment, but sharing in her parents' joy. Blake slumped in his chair, his head in his hands. The reality of his downfall crashed over him like a tidal wave. The judge ordered restitution to the Johnson family and recommended further investigation into Blake's business practices, opening the door for additional criminal charges. Outside the courthouse, Marcus was greeted by a sea of reporters. Cameras flashed and microphones were thrust toward him. "Mr. Johnson, how do you feel about the verdict?" one asked. Marcus paused, pulling Elena and Kayla close. "This isn't just our victory," he said. "It's a victory for justice. For every family that's been silenced, pushed aside, or treated unfairly. Today, we prove that the truth can stand against even the most powerful." The crowd erupted in applause as Marcus and his family walked away, their heads held high. The fight was over, but the message was clear. No one, no matter how powerful, is above the law. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Johnsons' new home, casting warm golden light across the unpacked boxes in the living room. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee, his eyes fixed on a stack of papers in front of him. Unlike the documents that had consumed his life in recent weeks, these were different: letters of thanks, messages of support, and invitations to speak at community events. Elena entered the kitchen, carrying 2 plates of breakfast. She set one in front of Marcus and sat across from him, her gaze soft and full of pride. "It feels good, doesn't it?" she said, breaking the quiet. "Knowing it's over." Marcus nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "It's more than that," he replied. "It's knowing that we didn't just fight for ourselves. We fought for something bigger, for everyone who's ever felt powerless." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Kayla's laughter from the backyard. Marcus turned to see her running through the grass, chasing bubbles that floated lazily in the breeze. The sight warmed his heart, a reminder of what he had fought to protect. Later that day, Marcus received a call from David Ramirez. The journalist's voice was as sharp as ever, but this time it carried a note of genuine admiration. "Marcus," David began, "you've done something incredible. People are calling you a hero." Marcus chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "I'm no hero, David. I just refuse to back down." "Well," David continued, "whether you like it or not, people are paying attention. I've had calls from advocacy groups, legal organizations. They want to work with you. Looks like your fight isn't over yet." After the call, Marcus sat in thought for a long moment. He had always considered himself a private man, someone who preferred quiet victories. But now he realized the impact of his actions extended far beyond his family. The victory in court had sparked something, a movement, a sense of empowerment in others who had been silenced. In the weeks that followed, Marcus and Elena founded the Justice for All Initiative, a non-profit organization dedicated to fighting housing discrimination and supporting families facing unjust evictions. Donations poured in, and the initiative quickly gained traction, with Marcus at its helm. His story inspired others to come forward, sharing their own battles and finding strength in his example. Meanwhile, Thomas Blake's world continued to crumble. His properties were seized, his name became a byword for corruption, and he faced additional charges as more evidence of his misdeeds came to light. The man who had once wielded power with impunity was now a symbol of downfall, a cautionary tale for others like him. One evening, as the Johnson family sat together on their new porch, watching the sunset, Kayla climbed onto Marcus's lap. "Daddy," she said, her voice filled with curiosity, "are we safe now?" Marcus wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "Yes, sweetheart," he said softly, "we're safe. And so are a lot of other families, thanks to what we've done." Elena rested her head on Marcus's shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've come so far." Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And we're not done yet. But for now, we can breathe. As the stars began to the sky, the Johnsons sat in quiet gratitude, their hearts full of hope. The fight had been long and hard, but it had been worth every step. Justice had prevailed, and in its wake, a brighter future had begun. Now that you've followed this story full of twists and emotions, we'd love to hear from you. Comment below and share what you thought about the plot and which moment was your favorite or most gripping. Don't forget to leave a like. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. This way, you won't miss any new stories we share. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next story.